The combine monitor showed 31 bushels per acre. Frank Alderman shut off the header and sat in the cab for a moment, engine running, looking at the number. The field behind him was cut. The wheat was in the tank. The number was not going to change. The county average for hard red winter wheat in Reno County, Kansas in 1985 was 87 bushels per acre. Frank had 31. He drove the combine to the end of the field, engaged the unloading auger, and watched the grain fall into the wagon. He did not call anyone. He did not drive to the co-op to report the yield. He went back for the second pass and finished the field before dark. And when he was done, he had his total: 1,860 bushels off 60 acres of ground that in a normal year would have produced somewhere between 4,800 and 5,400. He drove home. He ate supper. He pulled out the moisture meter and the grain probe he had used that morning, and he tested the sample he had set aside from the first cut of the day. The protein was 14.2%. Frank Alderman was 44 years old and had been farming the same 320 acres in southern Reno County since 1969, when he had taken over the operation from his father after 2 years working alongside him following high school. The farm was entirely dry land. No irrigation, no pivot, no groundwater rights that would have made a center pivot financially viable, even if he had wanted one. What he had was good ground, a rotation of hard red winter wheat and grain sorghum, and 16 years of experience reading the weather and the markets with the kind of attention that comes from knowing a piece of land through its cycles. He carried a moderate debt load by 1985 standards. His land note had been taken on in 1977, when he had bought the East 80 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. The note was at 9.5% and had 12 years remaining. His operating line, seed, herbicide, fuel, machine repairs, ran approximately $28,000 per year and was serviced from the crop proceeds. In a normal year, with yields close to county average and prices in the 3.00 range, the operation worked. Not generously, it worked. 1985 was not going to be a normal year. He had known this by the third week of June, when the soil moisture in his south field had gone to 0 in the top 18 inches, and the wheat was in the soft dough stage, the point at which kernel weight was being set and water stress would be directly translated into lighter grain and lower test weight. He had watched it happen, and there was nothing to do but watch. Hard red winter wheat in Kansas has 2 numbers that matter at the elevator: yield and protein. Yield is what everyone talks about. It is the number reported to the crop insurance adjuster, the number discussed at the coffee shop, the number that appears in the county extension reports that get summarized in the agricultural press. In 1985, a 31-bushel yield in Reno County was a failure by any standard reading of that number. Protein is different. It is a quality measurement, the percentage of the grain's weight that is protein, which determines how the wheat performs in milling and baking. Hard red winter wheat is the primary wheat used for bread flour in the United States. Bread flour requires protein content above approximately 12.5% to develop the gluten structure that makes bread rise and hold its shape. The Kansas City Board of Trade in 1985 quoted a base price for hard red winter wheat at a protein content of 11%. Each half point of protein above that base earned a premium, typically in the range of 0.03 to 0.06 per bushel per half point, depending on the buyer and the season. At 14.2% protein, Frank's wheat was 3.2 points above the 11% base, That was 6 half points. At 0.05 per half point, the premium was 0.30 per bushel, above whatever the base price was trading that day. The local elevator in Hutchinson was paying $3.14 per bushel for standard 11% wheat. Frank's wheat was worth $3.44. He sat with those two numbers, 31 bushels and $3.44, and did the arithmetic on the back of the test sheet from the moisture meter. 1,860 bushels at $3.44 came to $6,398. 1,860 bushels at $3.14, what he would have received at base protein, came to $5,840. The protein premium added $558 to his gross revenue on a 60-acre field. $558. On a year that looked like a total loss from the outside. And here's the part that still gets me. The same drought that cut his yield in half is exactly what gave him the protein numbers. You can't separate the two. The stress on the plant, the hard summer, that's what concentrated the protein in the grain. So the worst thing that happened to that field, that year, is also the thing that made it worth something extra. Same drought, same damage. Two different ways to look at the same harvest. The reason Frank's protein was high and his yield was low was the same reason, expressed differently. The summer of 1985 had been dry across central Kansas from May through June. The critical grain fill period when the wheat kernel develops its weight and composition. In adequate moisture conditions, the plant allocates energy to producing large, heavy kernels. High yield, moderate protein. Under moisture stress, the plant produces fewer kernels, but the protein concentration in each kernel increases because there is less starch competing for the same amount of nitrogen in the soil. Drought was the mechanism. Protein was one of its outputs. This relationship, moisture stress increasing protein concentration while reducing yield, was known to agronomists and to millers who had been buying wheat for decades. It was not widely discussed among farmers in the way yield was discussed, because in most years the relationship did not matter practically. In a normal year, you sold your wheat to the local elevator, received the going price with a small adjustment for moisture and test weight, and drove home. The protein premium existed in the price structure, but it was rarely the number that changed what a farmer took home. In a drought year, it was a different calculation. Frank had known this because of a conversation he'd had in 1982 with a grain merchandiser from a flour milling company who had come out to the county extension's annual wheat production meeting. The man had talked for 40 minutes about protein specifications and buyer premiums, and the difference between selling into the commodity market and selling directly to end-use buyers. He had explained that flour mills blended wheat lots from multiple sources to hit a consistent protein target, typically 12.5 to 13.5% for bread flour, and that in years when the regional average protein ran low, millers paid meaningful premiums for high-protein lots that they could use to bring their blends up to specification. The implication was straightforward. In a drought year, when everyone else's protein was low, the farmer with high-protein wheat had something the market specifically needed. The premium that existed in normal years as a modest adjustment became, in a drought year, a real competitive advantage. Most of the room had listened politely and gone back to talking about herbicide programs and the new varieties the Extension Office was trialing. The information had landed in the way agricultural information often lands at meetings like that: absorbed, filed, not immediately acted on. Frank had written down a phone number on the back of the meeting agenda. He had put the agenda in the glove compartment of his truck. The glove compartment of that truck had become the glove compartment of the next truck when he had traded in 1984. The agenda was still there, folded twice, the ink slightly faded, the phone number still legible. 3 years sitting in a glove compartment. That's the whole difference. Everybody in that room heard the same presentation. Most of them probably thought it was interesting and went home and forgot about it. Frank wrote it down. Not because he had some plan, not because he knew what was coming. Nobody knew that. He just thought it might matter someday and didn't throw the paper away. That's it. Same information, same room. He just kept the number. He called the number on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after harvest. The merchandiser's name was Phil Keating, and he still worked for the same milling company out of a regional office in Wichita. He remembered the county extension meeting. He asked about Frank's protein. Frank said 14.2. There was a pause on the line. Phil said that was a strong number for this year's crop. He said most of what was coming into their procurement network was running 12.5 to 13%, which was adequate for bread flour, but not exceptional. He said his company was actively looking for wheat above 14% to blend with lower protein lots to bring their average up to specification. He asked how many bushels Frank had. Frank said 1,860. Phil said that was a small lot by commercial standards. His company typically contracted in 50,000 bushel increments. He said he would have to check with his procurement manager. He said he would call Frank back by Thursday. He called Wednesday afternoon. The company would take Frank's 1,860 bushels at a premium of 38 cents per bushel above the Kansas City base price, 8 cents higher than the local elevator's protein adjustment. The total premium over base was 38 cents, bringing the effective price to $3.52 per bushel. Frank wrote the number down. 1,860 bushels at $3.52 came to $6,547. Against the local elevator at base protein, that was $707 additional revenue on 1,860 bushels. Against the local elevator with their protein adjustment, it was $149 more. $149 was not a transformative number. On a 60-acre field in a drought year, $149 was one fuel bill, or one equipment repair, or nothing at all depending on how you measured what the year had cost. What it was, on top of the local elevator price, was the entire margin between a month that worked and a month that didn't. Frank knew his numbers well enough to know which category October was going to fall into before that call. After the call, it fell into a different one. Frank loaded his wheat into the grain cart on a Friday and hauled it to the commercial elevator in Hutchinson, where Phil's company had a receiving arrangement. The scale ticket came to 1,847 bushels, slightly less than his field estimate within normal moisture shrinkage. At $3.52, the check was $6,501. He deposited it on the way home. In Reno County that harvest season, the crop insurance office processed claims on behalf of 23% of the county's wheat acreage, the highest claim rate since 1980. The county average yield of 87 bushels was pulled up significantly by irrigated ground and by fields in the northern part of the county that had caught a weather system in June that the southern fields had missed. Farmers whose dryland ground in the south of the county had come in at 30 to 35 bushels were filing claims, attending meetings with adjusters, and calculating what the next year's operating loan would need to cover. Frank had filed a claim too. The drought yield had triggered his policy threshold. The indemnity payment would come in September. But the check from the milling company had already cleared. The broader Kansas wheat market in 1985 illustrated something that most commodity price discussions tend to flatten. Not all wheat of the same grade is the same wheat. The Kansas City Board of Trade quoted a single price for hard red winter wheat that appeared in newspapers and on elevator chalkboards across the state. That price was a starting point, not an ending point. It assumed a standard protein content of 11%, a standard test weight of 60 pounds per bushel, and standard moisture. Every deviation from those standards, upward or downward, adjusted the actual price a seller received. In most years, the adjustments were modest. A farmer with 12.5% protein received a small premium. A farmer with 10.5% received a small discount. The range of variation was narrow enough that most producers sold to the closest elevator and received something close to the posted price without thinking much about the difference. In a drought year, the adjustments stopped being modest. The 1985 Kansas wheat crop averaged 11.8% protein statewide, below the bread flour specification that millers preferred. For millers running flour mills that were contracted to deliver bread flour at 12.5% protein or above, a below-spec state crop created a procurement problem. They needed high-protein wheat to blend with the average protein wheat to bring their output up to specification. They were willing to pay for it, and they were actively looking for it. In a year when most of the state's farmers assumed they had nothing worth marketing at a premium. Frank Alderman had 1,860 bushels at 14.2%. He had called before anyone told him to call. He had called because of something he had heard at a meeting 3 years earlier and chosen to remember, in the specific way that farmers retain information that might someday have a use, even when that use is not immediately apparent. The question of whether a low yield is a failure depends entirely on what number you are looking at. Yield is visible. It is the number on the combine monitor, the number the adjuster writes in his notebook, the number that determines what your neighbors think when they ask how your year went and you tell them. In 1985, Frank Alderman had a bad year by that number. 31 bushels against a county average of 87 was not a result anyone would choose, and was not a result Frank would choose again, given the option. But yield is one number, revenue is another, and revenue is a function of yield and price, and every decision made between the time the combine goes in and the time the check clears. Frank's 1,860 bushels returned $6,501. A neighbor who farmed similar ground on the same gravel road, same soil type, same depth to hardpan, same weather moving across both fields from the same direction in the same dry June, had yielded 34 bushels per acre on 60 acres. 3 more bushels per acre than Frank. He had sold to the local elevator at the standard protein adjustment and received $3.14 per bushel on 2,040 bushels. His gross was $6,406. More bushels, less money. Frank had not known his neighbor's numbers at the time. He had learned them the following winter at a grain marketing seminar put on by the Kansas Cooperative Council, when the two of them had compared notes over coffee during the break. His neighbor had been surprised. He had assumed Frank's year had been worse than his, because Frank's yield had been lower. The assumption made sense from the outside. It was wrong. The difference between the two outcomes was not the drought. The drought had treated both fields with the same indifference. It was not soil quality or farming practice or anything that had happened in 1985. It was a phone number written on the back of a meeting agenda in 1982, carried in a truck glove compartment for 3 years, and dialed on a Tuesday morning when most farmers in Reno County were calculating their losses and filing their insurance claims. The agenda is still in the glove compartment of Frank's current truck. He checks it every few years when he cleans out the cab to make sure the number is still legible. It is. He has not needed to call it again, but he has not thrown it away. If your yield is lower but your quality is higher, did you fail? What do you think was the more important number for Frank in 1985? Leave a comment below.